There really are people in this world that will make you check your doors at night, your windows, and if you have children, make you truly watch your surroundings when you're at the playground, or you see a sweet, helpful old man seeming to be loving and interested in you and your child. But that's just what he wants. He might be one of the most sadistic serial killers we've ever seen and had the worst resume, so much so that only certain people will even be watching this video because his crimes are so repulsive to what normal thinking is, even to the most terrible of serial killers. Albert might be one of the most empathetic people to ever walk the earth. He wasn't responsible for a great number of deaths that they could prove, although he claimed to have taken over 100 lives. It's just the ones that we know he put his hands on that they could barely prove that might truly scare you of what his victims went through. This is a little story about a little man with big terrible secrets named Albert Fish. When Albert was caught after being out in the world for years, almost like he escaped hell, doing the worst things possible that human hands can do, many people didn't believe Albert when he was confessing to his crimes, that he was embellishing the stories. But Albert looked at the man that was talking to him and simply said, "Why would you not believe the things that I say that I've done? I'm one of many people that are just like me. We know how to find one another." Imagine you're a young child. You come home, and when you walk into your parents' room, you see your father beating his back with a wooden board fashioned with metal nails coming out of it, blood running down your father's back, down to his feet, while standing there, naked, breathing heavily, sounds of pain and enjoyment mixed together. Do you become worried about your father, or do you become scared to live in the same house with this person? Or perhaps they tell you to hit them with the paddle and force you because they're your father. But before we knew him as the old-looking little man, he was young and youthful, and his name was Hamilton Howard Fish, known as Albert Fish, was the first and real true boogeyman. Children even called him this when they would see their little baby brother or sister walk off with a little gray man who was disappearing with children. And still to this day, as a parent, it can give you dark-deprived anxiety. The different avenues of Albert Fish are split up with different enjoyments of torture. On one side, he takes out his desire for punishment on his own body. The other enjoyment he finds with his victims that are helpless and begging to go home. There's no doubt that Albert enjoyed cruelty and ruthlessness on his own body, shoving needles in himself so deep that they stayed for years. The pleasure of open wounds, rubbing his own blood in his own hands, drinking his urine, and even feces. It's safe to say that when we look at the early stages of Albert Fish, we see a child that's become a product of his own environment growing up. Albert was built into a psychopath as a child, to where he grew up into a young man with a hatred and mutated ideas of what pleasure is, with levels that have not really been documented until then. There's really no hard evidence that Albert's mother and father ever abused him, but it is known throughout the inner family that mental illness had affected Albert's family. His mother suffering from illusions, outbursts, confusion. Albert almost makes his childhood sound loving and normal, that is, until he's sent away to an orphanage. When Albert was sent to the orphanage, he was already 5 years old, growing up with his siblings and his mother, having bonded with his family and trust. Albert's brothers and sisters were separated from him, going to other orphanages. His father had already passed away due to old age, already being in his 70s, living a hard life. This is one of the first big elements to take place in Albert's life, where he's literally taken from everyone he knows, everyone he loves and trusts. Now he's in a place where he's alone and scared. The only explanation that's known why Albert's mother sent all of her children away because of financial reasons, not able to take care of the children. She was a widow and had no help. But what Albert's mother thought may be the best decision would turn out to be a terrible decision that would create a monster in Albert. Albert speaks of when he's in the orphanage that it changed him. He saw cruelty he's never seen or witnessed before. He's sad, depressed, and scared, and is experiencing heartbreak at such a young age, with anger building. He says that nuns at the orphanage act out violent routines on the orphans on a daily basis, but Albert says he starts to enjoy it. From beatings to testimonies of children dying from being beaten too much, and the cruelty and embarrassment of standing in front of everyone while you're forced to take off your clothes as punishment. It's just the day-to-day life of Albert while he's a child. He's constantly hit, constantly has bruises, but as Albert is angry and forgets the gentleness of a hug, where it's replaced by being whipped on the back because he's told he's worthless and misbehaves, it warps his mind to where it turns into pleasure and safety and comfort. It's safe to say that Albert was made into something at St. John's orphanage until he was 9 years old, returning home to his mother, but Albert was not who he was when he left for the orphanage. Albert says that even when he's 9 years old, he enjoys inflicting pain on himself, eating and drinking his own waste, and enjoys the torture of others. As he goes right into young adulthood, it would seem as though Albert was sculpted by the devil himself. Going to the public pool, watching young men, young children, having an attraction to them, trying to understand it, but not only having an attraction, having desires that involved torture. He would sit in the locker room, watching young men dress and undress. The older Albert gets, the more his fantasies grow and become more bizarre, but he never says that they scare him, they just interest him more. His desire for sex and torture have become one, and like most serial killers, it starts to take up much of his time. There is an element that we can tell Albert had, that many other successful serial killers had as well. It was adapting into his environment, being comfortable, and making others feel comfortable as well. He knows how to gain people's trust, and put on a role, and play it well. Albert was not highly educated. He knew how to work with his hands, and not afraid to work hard for what he wanted. One of his main jobs that we know about was that Albert was a house painter, along with odd jobs that lead to other jobs that keep him around people and their homes, along with their children. Albert had an advantage growing up in the world that he lived in and carrying out his desires in it. The world didn't know of serial killers. They didn't think of other people would want to harm children, and on top of that, nobody ever thought of another person eating a child. There was no name, there was no word for what Albert was at the time, other than just pure evil, and seemed like something that may escaped hell. Albert fully admitted that he started off just abusing young boys growing up, taking advantage of them, having his way. He did this for quite some time before he murdered anybody. He would visit brothels where he could find men that would torture and beat him. When Albert started to pay attention to children, he says before he murdered anybody, he says he would find a male child, lure them into a basement somewhere secret with candy or promises, and attack them. Albert says plainly that the majority of the children were African American or disabled. He said he thought the police would not believe the child, or the child would simply not even be able to speak. Sadly, Albert would be right, because he would do this for decades and never be caught. Albert, only 15, when he's already acting out this extreme violence in his own neighborhood. As Albert's life continues to unfold, as some creature, something peculiar happens to Albert. He marries a lady that his mother sets him up with. She's 9 years younger than Albert, which makes her a minor. And to make a long story short, he has 6 children with the woman, but eventually she will run off and leave Albert alone with all of their children. Albert continues to be a decorator, as a painter, while being a parent, and still with his hobby of hurting children. But something happens to Albert that Albert said prompted him to have a new desire in his life and directs his next phase. Albert attends a wax museum with a friend where he saw bodies, some cut in half. Albert says that when he was at the museum, he saw men's genitalia dissected, and to his curiosity becomes extremely aroused, so much so that it changes his thinking to where he can't get rid of it out of his mind. But this is where Albert starts thinking of cannibalism and performing castration. Sadly, Albert's attraction for torture and physical contact has to do with children, so naturally, his victims will be children. Albert's already good at finding victims, smooth with fooling people that have children. A slow process starts to happen to children around places where Albert is known to live, work, or have connections to. They never come home. Albert's taking of children even makes the newspaper many times. So much so that unbeknownst to Albert, he has many detectives tracking him, looking for him, but they can't pinpoint who or where Albert is. But there is a little older looking man that has been seen and ran off by parents before, and authorities know that he goes by the name Frank Howard, and Frank Howard has been seen with missing children or talked to the parent of the missing child before. At one point, Albert finds himself in trouble and ends up in Sing Sing prison for just a little bit of time for grand larceny, but ironically, Albert will have a lifelong history with Sing Sing prison, but not in a favorable way. What we do know about Albert's actual murders that took place have a span from Washington, D.C. to New York City and Delaware, being trapped in the middle. Albert himself even makes a comment that he's had a child from every state. But what we do know may be too much information. Albert's murders are believed to start with a young man named Thomas, age 19. Albert took Thomas while in Delaware in 1910 for a crime that happened over 100 years ago. Still will frighten you with the lack of empathy that Albert has towards an innocent human, and what he does is beyond grotesque. Albert knew Thomas for a little bit of time, not long, but long enough to make Thomas feel comfortable around him. Thomas was a disabled young man, not able to protect himself from what was about to happen from a younger Albert Fish, who was much stronger. Albert said that he lured Thomas into an abandoned farmhouse where he got a hold of Thomas, able to tie him up and torture Thomas for the next 2 weeks, every day. The torture that Albert gave Thomas almost goes over every punishment known to man, sentences and words that shouldn't be repeated, things that only hell talks about, that murderers and rapists and unbelievers will go through. Albert will say this about Thomas when he thinks back on the crime: "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me." After 2 weeks of Albert's lust of pain and now boredom of Thomas, Albert goes to Thomas, cuts off half of his genitalia, cleans the wound, gives Thomas $10 and a kiss on the cheek, and simply walks out the farmhouse and goes home. Thomas's outcome has never truly been known, whether he survived or died from his wounds. This was simply an experiment for Albert, seeing what he liked and what he didn't like. But this would just be another chapter of his crimes on humanity and becoming an even more terrible version of himself. When Albert starts confessing of the murders he committed, he goes into detail, sometimes even too much detail, to where the transcript will not even be released. It's even noted by Albert's lawyer that Albert was out of his mind and crazy, and Albert says that God told him to do these things. From the first mutilation in 1919 of Thomas, going into the 1920s, Albert says he was quite busy with failed abductions and successful abductions of children. It's said that most of the time, Albert walked around with a bag, and in this bag was a meat cleaver, a knife, and a small handsaw. One of the first murders documented for Albert is of Francis McDonnell, age 9. Albert at first denies the murder, but soon, for some reason, has a change of mind and confesses in graphic detail. The story of Francis started on July 14th, 1924. Francis was outside on the street playing with friends. His mother was on their front porch watching all the boys play. Nothing out of the ordinary. But she said she saw an older looking man with a big mustache and all in gray watching the boys, talking to himself, making hand gestures about what he was mumbling, walking through the area but eventually disappearing, where Francis's mother went back inside her home. Albert had come back through and found himself alone with the boys. Albert entices Frances to come with him. He lures Frances into the woods, not far from where Frances's home is. From there, Albert took advantage of Frances, and simply, the rest of the story is far too graphic to tell. But to simplify with what you may be thinking of what did happen, in so many words, Albert first hurt Frances in a terrible way, and from that point, Albert treated Frances like he was a deer that he had caught in the woods, killing and then butchering on the spot. Eventually, Albert heard noises and ran off. When Frances is found, he's hanging from a tree to where Albert was in the process with his tools. Albert goes into detail about what he did with Frances to where you can even read about it today if you dare to put it in your mind. One of the biggest cases Albert is attached to was the murder of Grace Budd in 1928. This case would make the headlines, and everyone in a 200-mile radius knew of the disappearance of Grace Budd. The story's been told many times, but to simplify what happened, Albert had been in contact with the Budd family. Albert found an ad in the newspaper saying, "Young man, 18, looking for position in the countryside." Albert responds with a letter saying he would be more than happy to show up and meet the young man. On May 28, 1928, Albert shows up as Frank Howard. The family is more than happy to bring Frank into their home and introduce him to their children. As Albert meets the son that is wanting to come work for him, he soon meets his brother and starts talking about both the boys coming with him to help. He would be more than happy to employ both of them. But then, something terrible does happen. The little sister of the Budd boys, Grace, walks up to Albert, sits in his lap, eating strawberries, and Albert making her feel comfortable, almost as though he was a grandfather. From that moment, Albert changed his mind and made a decision that he was taking Grace with him. He simply stood up, walked over to the mantel, where he was told his original note was sitting right there. He saw it, grabbed it, put it in his pocket, and Mr. and Mrs. Budd said it was strange and unusual, but said nothing more of it. From that moment, Albert makes a quick story, but he has to leave because he says he's attending his niece's birthday party. He politely asked Mr. and Mrs. Budd if he could and he should take little Grace with him to have some fun, to be around children her own age. He'll have her back home within an hour or so. Grace is excited, and obviously not wanting to upset her son's new boss. Mr. and Mrs. Budd allow it, unbelievably. At that point, Albert walks out of the Budd house with their daughter, and the only piece of evidence, which would be the letter that he wrote to them. And just like that, Albert walks off with Grace Budd. In so many words, Albert and Grace end up at a big white house on the bottom of a hillside that still stands there today. And from that point on, when Albert has Grace at the home, he says, "It took me 9 whole days to devour her." Albert's last victim that he talks of still is so shocking and sickening that most people never recover from the story of what Albert did to little Billy. The story of Billy would go like this. 3-year-old Billy was last seen in a hallway of his family's apartment in Brooklyn. Billy was playing with 2 other boys, one 3 as well, and the other 12 years old. The 12-year-old went to his apartment for a moment. When he returned from leaving the 2 young boys alone, both the boys were gone. As the 12-year-old starts to tell the grown-ups that he can't find the little boys, a search will start. They find the one 3-year-old without Billy. He was asked, "Where's Billy?" All the little boy could say is that Billy was taken by the boogeyman. As Albert had been around the apartment, looking, snooping, he found the 2 young boys, but for some reason only took Billy. What Albert did to Billy is far too graphic to talk about, but in so many words, he preps Billy like you would a roast. Albert's cruelty towards human life goes far beyond any nightmare that a person can make up in their mind. Albert has a desire that makes him quiver with pleasure. His torturous motivations against other people that are helpless just don't seem to make sense. What we do know about Billy and what he went through with Albert, you have to be warned about what you read. It will make you disgusted with humanity. Albert explains in letters what he did to Billy. It's just one of the many letters that he sends. It's another thrill that Albert gets to enjoy long after the murder. Albert would have a process apart from taking children. He would send letters to the missing children's parents, writing anonymous, explaining to the parents how he took their child and what he did to them. The letter that got Albert into trouble and getting him caught would be that of Grace Budd's letter. Years after the murder of Grace, Albert sent an anonymous letter to the family telling them that he had taken Grace and gone into great detail about how and what he did to her. In this letter, Albert admits who he was, that he was the man Frank Howard that sat at their table, and that he was the man that took Grace. The Budds took the letter to the police station, shocked at what the letter said, but not surprised. They knew it had to be the same man that they had been looking for all these years. When police get a hold of the letter, they examine it. The letter was traced back to a place where Albert had lived. Eventually, the detectives track down Albert. When they first come into contact with him, Albert pulls out 2 razor blades. Trying to defend himself, he's taken down and placed into custody. When he's brought to the police station, the detectives that have been working the case for many years immediately start to see Albert, that he has looks of the little gray man named Frank Howard attached to so many cases they have been working. Albert doesn't put much of a fight up once the letters presented to him and other murder connections. He starts to confess, and one of the first things he says about the Grace Budd murder is that I wasn't there to take Grace. I was there for the Budd boy. It's said that Albert talks a lot, goes into detail, confesses to many murders, but only some can be proven, mainly one. Albert gives a full confession of the Grace Budd murder and tells them where to find what's left of her at the house that was still abandoned in upstate New York. Albert knew of this house because he didn't live far away from it, in a little white cottage house that's been torn down for many decades now. It's still not known how many victims Albert took to this home that still stands there today, rebuilt with families living in it, unaware of what really happened in the house. When police search the property, they start to find clues that Albert might be telling the truth. They start to find old children's clothes, some burned, some just rotting. They find a baby doll. They look in the old well, pumping it out. They look under the floorboards for clues, anything they can find to prove all the stories that Albert is telling them. But soon, they find many big pieces of the story that start to bring it all together. That Albert just might be the man he says he is, the boogeyman, cannibal. They start to find tools that Albert talks of using in his letters, a hacksaw, a meat cleaver for chopping through bone. It doesn't seem like a coincidence that they're starting to find what Albert told them would be there. But soon, they find what they believe to be the skull of Grace Budd. The story of Albert Fish is far from being over. From this point on, Albert continues to confess to stories. When Albert is caught and the connections are made of who he is and what he's done, the media grabs onto the story. It blows up. Newspapers can't seem to get enough of it. It's been an ongoing story for years, with many children disappearing from their home, some even right in front of their parents. Another situation starts to unfold that the media catches on to. Albert's children show up to try to help understand what's going on with the story that's coming out about their father, and trying to help authorities in any way they can. Albert's son and daughter are photographed while meeting the brother of Grace Budd, trying to help the family as much as they can. But from there, he's sent to Sing Sing prison where he awaits trial. But Albert still has secrets that he hasn't told, and even things that he has in his body that no one knows about yet. So remember, Until we talk about Albert Fish again, watch who's around your children, even if they are a nice little old man.